Well, first of all, thank you for all the organizers and especially for Ed for the invitation to be here. It is actually one of the things that I love, that I've learned to love about this past years that I've been able to participate both as audience member and as a speaker in a lot of things that I otherwise would not have been able to participate in. I have to say, I'm not a huge fan of the format where the webinar format because I can't see people's faces other than Ed's. So I will try and be as unautomated as possible, but it's very strange in not being able to see people's faces. But I do have a list of names, and I see some names that I'm familiar. So to those of you who I know who are in the list of names, thank you for joining and for hanging out. The paper that I'm giving, so I want to say a couple of things about my paper before I actually read the paper, and I will read the paper. I've been working on a series of projects that are interrelated but very different from one another. And where the general sort of concern or title or thematic is, is to ask what criticism, and especially criticism in relationship to political theory, can be today, given a whole series of changes, especially technological changes in the world. And I'll explain how that fits into the talk that I'm playing out today. One of these projects is a project on algorithms, and the sort of motivation behind that project is not to do sort of critical algorithm studies, where there's a lot of great projects out there on critical algorithm studies, but to actually ask myself, as somebody who's been trained trained putatively as a political theorist, what kinds of problems do these new technologies raise for us beyond the typical normative ethical problems and problems of legislation and regulation, especially that we deal with. In other words, for me, it's a really important aspect of our thinking politically about technical objects that we think about their status as objects, and they're, what myself and others refer to as their sort of political ontology as technical objects. In this regard, my thinking has been very much influenced by three figures, notably Stanley Cavell of The World Viewed, Miriam Hansen's work on cinema, and Deleuze's work more generally, but in this regard, especially his work on Hume and his work on cinema. And so for me, what does the critical tradition look like with the advent of a technology that I will say throughout this talk is fundamentally non-representational? And what I mean by this is that most of our critical thinking, most of the history, at least in the West, of Western critical thought, is rooted in some way, shape, or form, or at the very least is informed by an Aristotelian account of mimesis. We are critical of representations of ideas, representations of personhood, representations through language, representations through images, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the things that I began to sort of worry about is that these technical structures that we call algorithms are not structures that give us representations, or at least they sufficiently alter the status of a representation that it's not, we can't easily sort of say they're like this or they're like that. And so one of the sort of bigger questions that concerns me is, what is the relationship between a technical medium and our critical thinking? And so much of our ways of thinking critically about the world have been rooted, even though at least in the political theory world, it's not acknowledged. They have been rooted in our assumptions about what technical media do, including language, to say the least. And however we agree or disagree on what the nature of language is, we understand it as the medium through which we express one of the mediums or one of the media through which we express political beliefs. And we've spent, a lot of time historically thinking about language and politics. But there's a lot of other things that we don't think about in terms of the sort of ontology of the medium and how that enables and how that allows us to think critically about the way in which these technical objects operate in the political world, or in the world politically, I should say. So that's the sort of general, very large framework that I would basically reduce to the question, what does critical political theory look like in the age of the algorithm? And that's the motivation behind the project, with the suspicion that traditional accounts of criticism are inadequate to the specificity of the medium. So as you can see, people like Cavell and Hansen that ask the question about the specificity of the medium. David Roderick is another person who's been very helpful in this regard. In relationship to images, I want to ask the same question in relationship to political agency and political action. And so that's the sort of meta framing for the question that I have. And now I will start to read the paper. Hopefully, let me know if there's a glitch. So just I'll say very briefly one last thing about this talk. It's very much a preliminary kind of introduction to the set of problems that I'm interested in, and so I'm very much trying to think about. We can talk about it in the Q&A, but I'm very much trying to think about what kind of work I actually want to be writing. Since I've been writing a lot of academic essays on this topic, but I'm not sure that an academic book on this topic is like a research book, a theory book on this topic is exactly the way to go. But we can talk about that in the Q&A. But any suggestions and help in that regard is more than welcome. Okay, so basically what I want to begin is to ask, what is an algorithm? And as you might expect, my answer is going to be very straightforward and unambiguous, is that we know what algorithms are in terms of a function. We don't know what they are in relationship to everyday life. We know that it's a calculation, that it provides a set of series of computational rules for an input that then generates an output. And we know that both the term algorithm and the mathematical operations called algorithms emerged from a history of Europe's engagement with the Arabic world. And this is the slide of Khwarizmi. Rodrigo Ochegame, I believe is the way he pronounces his last name, explains that the term algorithm derives from the late medieval Latin algorismus, from the name of the Islamic mathematician al-Khwarizmi, pronounced Khwarizmi, whose manuscript in Arabic described the Indian system of arithmetic. The word's meaning eventually developed into the technical definition employed in today's computer science, that is, any well-defined computational procedure that takes some value or set of values as input and produces some value or set of values as output. This is as precise of a definition as the slide can get. As the algorithm can get, but there is even another one that is even more concise, which is the next slide, and unambiguous. This is from a 1979 paper written by the computer scientist Robert Kowalski. Algorithm equals logic plus control. Andrew Goffey explains that algorithms do things, and their syntax embodies a command structure to enable this to happen. And Tarleton Gillespie fills this in further by explaining that, in the broadest sense, algorithms are encoded procedures from transforming input data into a desired output based on specific calculations. All of this to say that these definitions are compelling, and they tell us what algorithms do, but none of them tell us much about algorithms beyond accounting for the mathematical function. In short, what I'm suggesting is that the definitional approach to understanding the political ontology of algorithms, which is my research, sort of how I'm thinking about my research in this area, is not going to get us very far beyond the algorithm is logic plus control formulation that Kowalski gave us back in the late 70s. And so it is by investigating the conditions of possibility of the specific medium that I propose we begin our reflections and address such questions as, what has made this medium so easily and so quickly part of our existence and of our political lives? What is it about the medium that is so convincing and compelling and significant? And, you know, to the larger question, what is its mode of existence? And to address this, and today I'm going to talk about what I find to be sort of three problems that stand in our way in answering these kinds of questions. At least three problems given the intellectual tradition that I come from, which is the European tradition of critical political theory. Algorithms are not representational structures, not in the manner that we typically understand what a representation is. The next slide, please. Now, of course, this is a famous portrait of Elvis. We recognize it as a portrait of Elvis because we have some memory of Elvis in our minds, and in our collective psyche, we can say with some confidence that the portrait is an imitation of the features of Elvis's face. It is not Elvis, but a representation of him, a likeness. What it actually is paint on a flat surface that depicts a likeness that is an image of Elvis. And after Jackson Pollock's strip paintings, the world lost all doubt as to whether a painting was anything other than paint on a flat surface, despite its ability to depict likenesses. But typically, we're happy to say that what we're currently looking at is a painting of Elvis's face. In the process of disobeying and refuting the lessons of his mentor, Plato, Aristotle says exactly this about art, that it is an activity of representation whose nature is imitation. Imitation is, as he says in the Poetics, also natural to man from childhood, one of his advantages over the lower animals being this, that he is the most imitative creature in the world and learns at first by imitation. And it's also natural for all to delight in works of imitation. I have no trouble with this Aristotelian premise. I don't think any of us do, although we're all critical of it in various ways. And evidence for this consistency lies in the history of Western art that is more or less a history of practices of imitation by us various media. Indeed, and up until very recently, imitation is what we understood media to do. Plato hated this, and Aristotle loved it. Plato would have turned us away from technologies of imitation. Aristotle understood imitation as human existence, and to turn away from it meant that we were either a slave, a beast, or a god. Imitation is what allows us to learn how to act, and our ability to act in the world is what makes us political animals. However, you may land on the interminable debate between truth and appearance, eidos and eidolon, reality and imitation. The fact of the matter is this: our modes of critical thinking and the myriad forms of critical political theorizing are one and the same with our reflections on and about forms of representation in their media. Critical thinking is thinking about representations, about the distinction between subject and object, the relationship between mimesis and logos, etc. And if you're not convinced, just think back to your reading of the first book of Hobbes's Leviathan that works so hard to set up his political theory of consent as a system of representation. A contract, he tells us, is a technical medium that represents obligations, duties, and responsibilities, which is to say, actions. In order for it to work, you need authorship and language. And in this respect, and despite our common and collective wisdom about his rejections of the scholastic tradition, Hobbes remains very close to Aristotle. There is no politics without representation, and there is no representation without technical media. But as I stated, an algorithm is not a medium of representation. It does not represent me or you, nor does it represent a world that is out there. It is a non-representational medium. The formula logic plus control does not present us with an appearance or a reality. Its modality of doing is non-mimetic. And my fear is that our histories, modes, and Traditions of critical political theory are not equipped to deal with the political existence of non-representational media. The second problem, which stems from the first, requires a bit more explanation. Traditional approaches to political theory critical political theory require and indeed presuppose perceptual experience. When we critique something, we experience something, whether an idea expressed in language, the plot of a film or a play, the dynamics of a visual image, a historical event, what have you. All of these things are available to experience because a medium renders them phenomenally. And our terms of criticism are oriented towards addressing individual or collective perceptions of the experiential object or event. The problem then is this: we do not experience an algorithm. We experience a computer screen, a keyboard, and a mouse. We experience touch screens and listening devices, and we experience inputs and outputs. But we don't experience algorithms. They are non-experiential media, or if you want, they are anesthetic. The best we can do, which most people can't do, including myself, is program and analyze code. So the question, what mode of criticism is available to non-representational, non-experiential media? The next slide, please. This question and the anxiety it exudes is not assuaged if instead of thinking of painting and portraiture, we think about photography, like the photograph of Elvis above. Photography is a 19th century invention that, for all intents and purposes, revolutionized how we think about art and politics. Many 20th century political and cultural thinkers who have studied photography, from Benjamin to Bazin, Teresa de Lauretis, Panofsky, Laura Mulvey, Cavell, Felicity Coleman, and so on, all agree that the science and technology of photography and cinema pressured us to have to rethink our terms of critical discourse, given the mode of existence of this new technical object. Contrary to our most deeply held intuitions, photographs are not representations. They don't produce a likeness. Indeed, and for the first time in history, photographs forced us to have to forego likeness as a criteria of aesthetic and political evaluation. Here's why. Photographs were, and I say were because I'm tempted to say are, but they aren't anymore, and that's part of the issue that I'm sort of raising. But photographs were photochemical transcriptions of an actual existing reality. That photograph of Elvis is not an imitation of Elvis. It is Elvis. He was there, present, when the photograph was taken. His presence is transcribed onto a photochemical surface to produce evidence of his having existed. If this ontology of the photographic image seems dubious, or maybe it rubs you the wrong way, just think of how pointless as evidence a painting of someone stealing a car would be in a courtroom, and how compelling a photograph of someone stealing a car is instead. What is more, no photograph is ever taken by a photographer. It is taken by a camera. That the photographer sets up the shot and presses the button to release the shutter and expose the film simply means that the person has assisted the camera in capturing a reality. But it is the camera that takes the picture, not the photographer. In short, photography and movies, that is, the technology of photochemical transcription from the 19th century daguerreotype to the 1970s Polaroid, are automated realities. Or, to use the specialized language that I borrow from Stanley Cavell, they are automatisms. It took some time before a photograph could be considered side by side to a work of art, like poetry or painting. And the reason for this is precisely its mode of existence as an automatism. For much of the 19th century, photographs were demonized in the art world, though not so in other domains, especially those of police force and government and statistics. The history of photography begins with the history of statistics, and not so much the history of visual culture as such. But it gave way to the history of visual culture very quickly. Gustave Baudelaire, though praising the modernism of his time and lamenting the capacity of so few artists to capture its beauty, was among the most damning of detractors of photography. And I'm going to read a passage that is should be slide number 7. The next slide. During this lamentable period, a new industry arose which contributed not a little to confirm stupidity in its faith and to ruin whatever might remain of the divine in the French mind. The idolatrous mob demanded an ideal worthy of itself, appropriate to its nature, that is perfectly understood. In matters of painting and sculpture, the present-day credo of the sophisticated, above all in France, and I do not think that anyone at all would dare to say the contrary, is this: I believe in nature, and I believe only in nature. There are good reasons for that. I believe that art is and cannot be other than the exact reproduction of nature. A timid and dissident sect would wish to exclude the more repellent objects of nature, such as skeletons or chamber pots. Next slide, please. Thus, an industry that could give us a result identical to nature would be the absolute of art. A revengeful God has given ear to the prayers of this multitude. The Daguerre was his Messiah, and now the faithful says to himself, since photography has given us every guarantee of exactitude that we could desire, they really believe that the mad fools. Then photography and art are the same thing. From that moment, our squalid society rushed Narcissus to a man to gaze at its trivial image on a scrap of metal. A madness and extraordinary fanaticism took possession of all these new sun worshippers. Could be written about Instagram by some people. I should note that there has never been a moment, as far as I know, when an expression of moral panic hasn't coincided with the emergence of a new technical possibility of an art form. This was the case, obviously, with the poets for Plato. It was the case with comedy for Shakespeare. It was the case with 18th century novel. And it has been the case with photography, film, television, telegraph, radio, telephone, and now digital media. It's for this reason that I wish to pose the question that I do regarding the mode of existence of the algorithm before I make any kind of normative claims about its value as an instrument. Returning to Baudelaire's condemnation, it is to our listening humorous and the kind of thing that if I were to say it at home to my son would likely respond to him saying, okay, boomer. But it is also a perfect snapshot, pardon the pun, of the sentiments of the period. Baudelaire derides the opinion of a multitude that are attracted to this new kind of image, and it is seemingly exalted mode of satisfying the human desire of holding reality in the palm of one's hand. But he does so relying on a classic aesthetic conventions that were well ensconced and in place in the period. He chooses his words wisely. He doesn't concede that a new practice has arisen, but a new industry. A photograph is the product of labor, not an art. And what's worse, it is automated labor. The word industry marks this conjunction since the French word industrie means both labor or effort and mechanical automated movement. That by this point in the 19th century European life is synonymous with the steam engine and its ubiquity in the factory. Moreover, the photograph corrupts the divinity of mind, the traditional source and spring of genius, genius being the political and legal justification for an object to count as a work of art according to French copyright law. And more on that in just a second. This squalid invention, Baudelaire insists, claims a relationship to nature that the artist's hand could never procure, and it is precisely this that stings him to the core, and he knows this. He knows that photographs capture a reality, and they do not represent one. This is how they are one with nature, because a photograph is a kind of natural object. It is an automatism made by a natural process of photochemical exposure. A photograph is not about nature, it is of nature, and it's precisely because of their inability to represent reality that photography can only offer a trivial image on a scrap of metal. The Daguerre is a false messiah, and we, the idolatrous mob that handles, consumes, and gazes at the photographic image, are all members of a heretical cult, the new sun worshippers. I just suggested that Baudelaire's vitriol is a perfect expression of the period, and now I want to show how that 19th century moment bears a family resemblance to our current algorithmic condition. As I just noted, the 19th century proved a tumultuous time for the art world, especially in Europe. It was a time that saw the emergence of new technical media that infiltrated aesthetic practices and challenged extant conventions of the work of art, as well as development of new critical theories and vocabularies for judging these works. This was especially palpable in post-revolutionary France, where the legitimacy of the fine arts had been codified into law with the 1793 Declaration of the Rights of Genius by the National Assembly. This was protected materials that were productions of mind or genius. This is a quote. And as Anne Macaulay rightly notes, it was a law that did something more than render works of art objects of property, though it importantly did that. It had to do that because, this is just as an aside, it was essential for them to be works of property because that way it was the only way in which you could extract the laws that existed prior to the French Revolution on the reproduction of text by publishing houses from the right of royal privilege. The language of the 1793 Declaration made it so that the works were an extension of the artist legally defined as a coherent personality, not just something the maker had acquired through labor. And therein lies one of the many elements that contributes to a modern conception of a technical medium. A medium's mode of existence is not determined by what it makes, its output, but by the nature of the action that went into the production of the output. In order for a work of art to count as one, it needed to be distinguished from mere mechanical labor. And what makes that distinction possible is the attribution of human intention to the work in question, human intention being a synonym for the legal definition that confines the outworld to productions of mind or genius. Of course, the other synonym for this is authorship. Hence the many disputes that arose in the period regarding artistic production and its relationship to labor, all of which help explain why the right to sign one's work was such a contested issue in the 19th century, including at the time of the Paris Commune's short-lived attempt at overcoming the division between the fine and decorative arts. The 1793 Declaration demanded that any artist who wanted to claim artistic status for their work had to verify that the object was not simply a mechanical reproduction, which is what the printing presses did. They reproduced something mechanically, but it was what today we might call an original work. This means that creating an image or sculpture mechanically or automatically is not protected by copyright, according to a December 2, 1814 decision of France's Supreme Court. A decision that determined that there was no infringement in taking further casts from the master mold without the consent of its original author or manufacturer. A sculpture created by hand, and I asked for the next slide, which should be the death mask slide. A mold is a form of mechanical reproduction that produces casts automatically. No one sculpts the product of a mold. Though the output may be two identical busts, those two busts are not the same. They are ontologically different. Such ontological difference is grounded in the means of production of the work of art, not in the work itself, nor its appearance. These legal and aesthetic considerations into the mode of existence of a work of art were the basis for a decision upheld by the 1834 Correctional Tribunal of the Seine with regards to Napoleon's death mask, molded by his physician, Francois Carlo Antomarchi, the mask that you're looking at right now. The process of capturing by means of taking a cast, and this is a quote from the decision, or from an account of the decision, the process of capturing by means of taking a cast from a person's face could not establish an exclusive right. The judges indicated that if one were to compare the product of a purely manual operation to the work that a sculptor has produced, that would have amounted to extending the provisions of the lay beyond what was a work of mind or genius. In short, what Walter Benjamin famously referred to as the Age of Technological Reproducibility was one where the associational milieu emergent from a series of legal, artistic, scientific, and technical practices that would eventually elevate the products of mechanical technology as objects of copyright, and thus objects of artistic production and property. This in turn blurred the dividing line between work and labor, as well as the dividing line between human and automated movement. This division between labor and work were very much in play in another really important case that is, for me, foundational for the things that I'm studying right now, and the 1862 case that stood before France's Supreme Court, and that remains a watershed decision for the artistic status of automatically produced objects, and specifically photographs. Known as the Meyer-Pearson case, the issue regarded the matter of appropriation of a famous picture taken by the company Meyer and Pearson of the Italian Count Cavour, a political celebrity of 19th century Europe Cavour's carte de visite, the 19th century equivalent to our selfies, became even more popular after his death. And those taken by the Meyer Pearson photography company were especially sought after. So much so that it had been reproduced by various other companies and sold as their own. Just as sort of a side note for those who don't know, as I didn't know, a carte de visite is basically what today we would call a business card, or that rather than having the information of address and title, had a picture of the person that you were meeting with. People gave out snapshots of themselves, basically. This lawsuit was a watershed decision that allowed something other than a hand-drawn image to count as a work of visual art, a decision, I should add, that inaugurated a series of debates regarding the distinction between art and technology. A photograph is a product of science and technology. All photographs involve the automated transcription of a physical object onto a chemical surface. And as we noted earlier, though we like to believe that the photographer-director is the agent of the shot, the dispute around the Meyer-Pearson case reminds us of the contested nature of this common sense. In short, the 1862 decision wasn't one that consolidated the distinction between art and science, but one that blurred it, because the decision determined that automated or mechanical activity or technical reproducibility was a valid form of artistic work that could have copyright protection. In other words, Meyer-Pearson won their case after several stages of appeal. And this decision and its legal, aesthetic, and political implications shook the 19th century to its core. If a mechanical reproduction could count as a work of genius and be protected by copyright, as a photograph now could, then any automatism, including human factory labor and mechanical activity par excellence, could also have the value of work. And if that is the case, then the products of one's labor should count as one's property. And it's no surprise then that Karl Marx would ultimately land on the term proletariat as the polemical name for his revolutionary class of workers. Proletarians, from the Latin proletarius, being, according to a classification of peoples in ancient Rome, it was the citizen of the lowest class who served the state, not with their property, but with their children, proles. The proletarius's function is automatic biological reproduction. And all other things being equal, so is the case for the 19th century laborer, who reproduces commodities mechanically and automatically. After the 1862 decision on photography, it becomes possible to count the product of an automatic reproduction as valuable enough to warrant copyright protection, that is, property protection, which also means that those other automatisms could count as a legitimate human activity worthy of similar protections. By granting mechanical reproductions the status of property, the Meyer and Pearson decision opened the door for all forms of automatisms to potentially hold copyright and thus value. These political, legal, aesthetic, and theoretical concerns regarding the nature of the photographic medium made possible a rethinking of the line that divides human work and machine work, and they put weight on the privileged intuition that human agency is a special kind of activity, that there is something about human activity that distinguishes it either from the happenstance of nature or the roteness of automatic movement. But it's precisely this fact of human automaticity that was a dominant theme of concern in the 19th century, and that is also central to our investigation into the algorithm's mode of political existence. So I realize that my time is starting to run out, but I wish to raise two more observations before I finish. Why does all this business about photography and automaticity and art and labor matter so much, at least to me? In part because, as you might have sensed, the questions raised by this entanglement issue finds kinship with our own attentions to the nature of political life, to narrative, to personality, to all of the things that traditionally fall within the spectrum in my discipline of critical political theory. And as I repeatedly sort of suggested, the invention and proliferation of technical media always reintroduces the questions of the nature of human agency and of the relationship between life and world anew. Think of Galileo's telescopic lens, or Gutenberg's printing press, Plato's cave, Aristotle's Homer, and now Google's algorithms. More than representational instruments or transmission devices, media are transformational objects that intermediate worldly existence. The next slide, please. And I should have told you, this is the image of Count Cavour that had been circulating. It was the cause of the Meyer Pearson case. The next slide again, please. Okay, you should be able to click on this and play it without volume. Right. So to be brief, here's my next point. The motives of the existence of the algorithm is not akin to either painting or photography. The algorithmic image isn't an image at all for two fundamental reasons. The first is historical. We are not in a position to grasp its possible genealogy, and thus we are not in a position to understand a conceptual morphology that might allow us to conclude that a digital image is in fact an image. The second reason is again existential. The philosopher David Roderick puts the matter best. These forms are also without image in the sense that what appears on electronic or digital screens does not fully conform to the criteria by which in the past we have come to recognize something as a created aesthetic image. And again, this is why I say we find ourselves in the situation of the Meyer Pearson again, interrogating all of these issues that constitute the technical milieu of this object, of this technical object. On electronic screens, we are uncertain what happens, that what appears before us is an image, and it is its powers of mutability and velocity of transmission. We are equally uncertain that this perception has a singular or stable existence, Roderick tells us, either in the present or in relationship to the past. Roderick here is telling us that the algorithmic image is neither a representation of reality, nor a transcription of it, photochemical transcription of it, but something else, perhaps something closer to a transcoding operation of what Joanna Drucker, my colleague here at UCLA, calls CAPTA. The digital camera does not photochemically transcribe an image. What it does is capture electronic impulses, codifies them as information, and disposes them in such a way as to produce an algorithmic image. But, and here is the crucial point, the CAPTA of electronic information need not belong to the physical world. Because its basis and processes are computational, the very nature of digital information processing is to be without substance in the ordinary sense of the term. The functional mode of the algorithm is to capture and render information by generating, and I quote, tokens of numbers through a process of calculation producing a mathematical equivalent of what humans would call perception. Next slide, please. The reason why, just to explain very quickly, the dot-to-dot image here is that it seems to me that it's at the very least a much better analogy of what a digital image is than a connecting of the dots by an arranging of the pixelations than what we traditionally understand as images. With this preliminary set of reflections, we begin to sense that the mode of existence of the algorithm requires a rethinking of both the ontology of the medium and a rethinking of the forms of political and aesthetic criticism available within it. With the algorithmic image, there isn't a specific medium, but a dynamic of functions that generate outputs. And given that so much of our practices of political theorizing are framed by the representational power of word and image, how might we begin to think the non-representational and anesthetic dynamics of capture, rendering, transcoding information, and calculation politically? In other words, a critical political theory of the algorithm cannot simply begin and end with the output or product of computational processes, as if that output were a representation. When we look at a digital image, what we view on our screens has little basis in physical reality. It is wholly virtual, neither real, unreal, nor hyperreal. It is a simulation that has no relationship to anything in the world. It is neither model nor copy. Next slide, please, that I'm going to have to explain. This is more, this is taken from an online story, but you're not able to click it. But if it's a very interesting website for those of you who might be interested in checking it out. The website is This Person Does Not Exist. .com. All this person does not exist altogether.com. None of these faces, which are taken from the website, are actually real people in the world. What this website does is it's an algorithmic technology that pits two AI learning algorithms against one another in a kind of game theoretical scenario, such that they're constantly generating and competing with one another to constantly generate pictures of what we see as humans, but they're not actually pictures of humans. They're digitally generated images of people who do not exist. And to that extent, this is true of the image. That is, to the extent that this is true of the image, it is also true of the algorithmic image. That is, it's neither model nor copy. It is also true of algorithmically based computational technology that simulate analogical functions like cut, paste, and type. Given this, we're inclined to say that algorithms manipulate information, and this isn't wrong, though the term manipulate is for me overdetermined. Algorithms do manipulate information, but not in a sense of distorting some reality about the world, because as we've just noted, they are not technologies that engage reality. They are non-representational and therefore neither necessarily normatively good nor bad. There is only functionality at the level of the algorithm and at the level of its programming as well, if you've talked to people in computer science departments. The central question here is, does it work or does it not? A bad algorithm is not one that distorts the mind's perceptions. It is one that cannot complete the task it is programmed to do, which means that bad algorithms are simply ones that are poorly programmed or inefficient. They just crash. We can begin to think of the activity of algorithms as a kind of moving things about then. The transformative power of algorithms' political ontology is to capture data and dispose it automatically. In short, they move us, although we have to interrogate what this us is. And this, I believe, is the fundamental difference between a representation, a transcription, and an algorithmic transcoding. Algorithms possess what I wish to call dispositional powers that are neither determinate, like Newton's law of gravity, nor wholly indeterminate, like Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. The dispositional powers of the algorithm do not operate to constrain freedom, but on the contrary, to incessantly and automatically move things about. In this regard, the aim of political power is no longer the domination of the present, but the management of futures. Finally, I ask, how might we understand this algorithmic condition of perpetual mobility? Again, I'm going to have to be very brief, but the way that I begin to answer this question is by turning to some work, some of the original work in the post-war cybernetics. Algorithms, as I understand them, are a stable organization that automatically arrange things in the world. And in that way, they are rooted in the cybernetic discovery of negative feedback. Cybernetics was named by a group of MIT polyglots, the chief proponent, the name most associated with it being Norbert Wiener, in his seminal book, Cybernetics, or Control and Communication in Animal and Machine, where he states that he and his colleagues decided to call the entire field of control and communication theory, whether in the machine or the animal, by the name cybernetics, from the Greek kybernetes, meaning steersman. In choosing the term, he says, we wish to recognize that the first significant paper on feedback mechanisms is an article on governors published by the Scottish theoretical physicist J. Clerk Maxwell in 1868, and that governor is derived from the Latin corruption of kybernetes, of the Greek kybernetes. We also wish to refer to the fact, he says, that steering engines of a ship are indeed one of the earliest and best developed forms of feedback mechanisms. The feedback mechanism, or negative feedback, the finalized term of art, refers to corrective mechanisms for the control of movement in space and time. The problem and the idea all began with a World War II dilemma that ultimately produced radar technology. How is it possible to hit a random moving target with accuracy? The specific target in this case were the planes of the German Luftwaffe, and the projectile was a US and British anti-aircraft fire. An important 43 paper entitled Behavior, Purpose, and Teleology, Wiener and his colleagues established a founding abstraction of cybernetics and of our algorithmic condition. At the level of observable movement, humans are indistinct from machines. This means that information has a behavioral component. It moves about. What matters in the study of cybernetics, then, is not the behavior of individual beings, but the behavior of information emitted by moving entities. This because human behavior can be reduced to a set of informational impulses at once traceable and identifiable. Thus, it doesn't matter whether the moving entity is a human or a consumer product or a submarine missile. In fact, it shouldn't matter. What does matter is that the energy differentials that appear as a result of movement and all that needs arranging or disposing are the data points that correlate with those energy differentials and nothing else. In short, our cyberneticists accepted the behavioral description of movement provided by Pavlov and especially B.F. Skinner that gives primacy to all those moments of human living that are automatic and rote. And what they did is simply collapse the distinction between cerebral mechanisms and nerval mechanisms. Here is how J. Haubin described this insight. The tracking radar and the human trackers played the same role, almost as if each were a servo mechanism. Both introduced similar high-frequency correction activity that could be filtered out. The total automatic system, with its sensory input and processing and aiming and firing outputs, seemed almost lifelike. And now here's Wiener's account for the same thing. The term feedback is also employed in a more restricted sense to signify that the behavior of an object is controlled by the margin of error at which the object stands at a given time with reference to a specific goal. The feedback is then negative, that is, the signals from the goal are used to restrict outputs which would otherwise go beyond the goal. All purposeful behavior may be considered to require negative feedback. One of the things that I'm trying to develop is the idea that negative feedback is a central figure of the political existence of the algorithm. It is the great cybernetic achievement that allows for successful signal transmission to be the model for all purposeful behavior, and whose success relies on a corrective set of rules that persistently send signals of information back and forth between user and interface so as to restrict outputs and maximize the success of future outcomes. And restrict outputs, which is the term, is a substitute term for the other important term in cybernetics, which is control. Hence the importance of the term cybernetics to denote the science of control and communication, and also the importance of the idea that a governor or steersman functions like an automated corrective mechanism that manages or restricts outputs, manages the oscillations of futurity and randomness. Neither conscious nor unconscious negative feedback operates at the level of the automatism of purposeful human behavior, as is the stimulus response of conditioned reflex described by Skinner. What then are the parameters for a negative feedback ontology, for its mode of existence? First and foremost, there is prediction. Negative feedback is treated as an automated mechanism for the prediction of future outcomes or outputs. A second related parameter is uncertainty. The cybernetic world is random, and the possibility of purposeful action or outcome has to be viewed within the context of such randomness, or, of course, the other term for such randomness is entropy. Negative feedback, in other words, is an automated mechanism for arranging attention amidst a state of constant distraction. Third, negative feedback operates on the basis of an exchange of information via the communication of impulses. These impulses register a change in that is transcoded as data. Hence, negative feedback is an automated system for the tracking, capture, and management of discrete perceptions and attentions. And the fourth parameter is the discrete serialization of everyday life and action. Data is the marker of a change that is captured, and I'm using Colin Koopman's term. I can talk about Koopman's work if you like. His term is fastened to a discrete value that coordinates a series of further discrete values so as to create a probabilistic sequence. Prediction, uncertainty, correlation, serialization, these are elements of the negative feedback ontology that helps us attend to the mode of existence of the algorithm. I'm going to wrap up now at some point and basically say that, ask, where does this leave us, both ontologically and politically? It leaves me very confused because once again, I find myself having to ask who or what we are and how we fit into a world that no longer acknowledges our existence as either portrait or picture, or indeed human. That is to say, we are once again dealing with a situation where the advent of technological informations compel us to have to reinterrogate our relationship, our human relationship to the world, and how that relationship is mediated. This is an ontologically disturbing condition, which, is not necessarily a bad thing. The situation feels troubling, though I want to say likely no more troubling than how Baudelaire must have felt about photography. But it's also disturbing because it seems clear to me that we do not yet have a way of thinking critically about the political theory of algorithms. And because it feels like traditional forms of critical political theory are insufficient to the task, or at least I hope that I've given you reasons to concern yourself with the possible limits of our critical tradition in relationship to the algorithm. To worry about the circulation of falsities, the deployment of fake news, the sense of privacy invasion, and all the other concerns affiliated with more traditional forms of critical theory seems off the mark to me. This is not to say that we shouldn't be concerned with these things. I would be insane to suggest that, of course, but it doesn't seem to me that that way of concerning ourselves with the world is especially efficacious when dealing with algorithms. Like it or not, we can't condemn algorithms because we can't turn away from them or turn them off. Planes would crash, traffic would come to a halt, and life support systems, not to mention our entire living infrastructure. Now, when I originally penned this paper, this was before Zoom, so our entire work structure, or in this case, webinar, this webinar format would have fallen apart. So yes, we end on a confusing and perplexing note and with a daunting task ahead of us. At the very least, I hope that my remarks today might help us orient us in some way, shape, or form on how we might begin to enact an initial suspension of theoretical activity in order to enhance our receptivity to the moment and to the radical situation that our contemporary moment is experiencing. And on that note, I have finished my talk, and I very, very much look forward to the Q&A. So thank you very much for your attention.
Should be able to get some folks up who have questions. So let's see who's got questions. So I asked people to holler at me in chat. So I'm kind of waiting to hear if I've got hollers. Anybody hollering? Oh, okay, Demetrius, yes. Okay, so hang on just 1 second. Let me promote you here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make you a panelist and let you ask yourself. So you can, you should be. Let me unmute you and okay, talk.
Okay, am I promoted now?
You are promoted.
You hear me? Oh, fantastic! I should be using this program more. I got confused in the morning because I assumed it was Zoom, and yeah. Anyway, look, that was a great presentation. I have a question that is actually a bit of a. I was actually puzzled as I was listening to you about the move that you're making, and I'm not even sure. So I'm not. Does my camera work? I don't even know how to do it. But anyway,
I don't think I can turn the camera on for. Maybe I can. I don't know.
Anyway, it doesn't matter.
Do that.
The point is very simple. Okay, so you made, Davide, you made a kind of move throughout your paper, basically saying, hey, if we look at the traditional forms of representation, and you mentioned Hobbes, we cannot say that algorithm is representational. If we look at the traditional conception of the image, it's the same, an algorithmic image is not, it doesn't conform with the mimetic concept of the image that we have in the past and so on. Okay, so your kind of inference from that is the algorithm is not an image and it's not a representation. Okay, my question is, if you think of the first paragraph of Benjamin's the work of art in the Age of Technological Reproducibility, which basically says, well, reproducibility has changed how we understand images. Can you not make the same move and say, instead of saying, the algorithm is not a representation, can you not say instead, the algorithm has changed our conception of representation and has changed our conception of the image? And if you make that move, what does that mean for the rest of the paper? I mean, the rest might remain exactly the same. I was just trying to compute, as I was listening to you, what the difference would be if you make that move. I mean, me as a philosopher, I'm kind of, inclined to create concepts, and that's how to create a concept,
No. That's a great question, and it's partly why I try to do that little sort of genealogy of moments in which people try to figure out the changes in their relationship to images. Part of me, and thank you for showing up, Demetrius. I don't know what time it is in Sydney, but it's amazing that that you're here, Pierre. There you are. Now I can see you. Part of me wants to say that. So, a lot of that stuff that you heard is my riff off in filling in a lot of the stuff that, as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, Cavell does in Worldviewed. And part of me wants to say that we have to take seriously the fact that the material fact, right? And this is the sort of Humean empiricist in me, the material fact that something is different, right? So how do we account for that difference, right? Is the difference adequately accounted for? In other words, it's a different object, right? And I think, to me, I don't know why it struck me. Maybe it doesn't strike other people as much, but that, this person does not exist website was really sort of captivating to me, right? Because it's not even a deep fake. It's just automatically generates people that I could be friends with that don't exist, right? And so, to me, it really is a kind of question about the relationship between critique, politics, and ontology as to whether we can transcribe or transpose a critical apparatus that was explicitly conceptualized in relationship to a particular, in this case, to a particular technology of the image, whether we can transcribe and transpose it to something that gives us a completely different material, if it is even a material entity,
Well, and what I'm saying is, instead of saying that we're transposing it, can we say that we kind of come to understand the past in a different way through the algorithm? And I mean, why, in a sense, I'm asking this question, because in my own research, as you know, like I try to argue that actually the algorithm goes much further back, even though it wasn't understood as algorithm. So the algorithm always existed in my kind of work. So for me, it's a kind of question with a lot of baggage. I have to be able to say that representation, that algorithm always influenced representation, even though the old conception of representation didn't know it. That's the reason I'm asking the question. It's not a simple transposition.
Right. I see why you're asking the question. I think, so here's the, I mean, maybe it's just because I reify this term in my talk, algorithm, and it obviously requires more sort of specificity. But I think something, so I'll answer this speculatively because I don't have a good answer to it. I think something radical happened with the advent of Bayesian probability calculations that have shifted our sense of temporality and our understandings of variability in significant ways. That and by variability, I mean the ontological concept of difference in itself in significant ways that I don't think we can recuperate from it. And I do think that the way it was taken up and developed computationally in the 70s, from the very little that I understand, because I'm just not, I know, like I've read about this stuff, but I couldn't explain the mathematics to you. But from the very little that I understand, I think it really is a substantial, I'm not one of those people that's like, oh, this is like totally new, but I think it was substantially, radically different in terms of how we understood our relationship to time, that at the very least, we have to rethink a lot of things. I think you're right. I think that there's, that I overplay my hand. And in part that has to do with the fact that I usually talk, this paper and this research is really, for me, hard to not just to do, but to sort of talk about in the traditional setting. And this is a question, a thing around disciplines, because most political theorists have spent their entire history, at least since the post-war period, avoiding anything that has to do with computation and defining the discipline against the idea of computation. So now to introduce that, all of this to say is that rhetorically in the paper, I'm trying to make it, I overplay my hand, obviously, but I do this for professional disciplinary reasons that say, like, I'm usually talking to political theorists that don't have no clue as to what's happened in the computational sciences, and at best, I'm talking to political sciences that have absolutely that have a lot of understanding of what's happened in the computational sciences and use them every day, but have no understanding of that there are normative stakes involved in the use and deployment of these things, and just treat them as abstract functions that And so what I do want to say is that, like, no, you're actually doing something that's world historically significant, right? And that we need to think about what the world historical significance of this is. And I'm not sure that that we can and when I do make that move that you're pointing to, that rightly makes you nervous, and it makes me nervous too every time I sort of read the versions of this paper or other papers where I make that move. I have actually in the back of my mind a very culturally specific American legal liberal response to everything that's happening in the world, which is just like, oh, regulate the algorithms so that they can be more fair, right? And it's just like, that's not the point, right? That's just not the point at all. Like, so all the big things, in the legal world here in the United States, the big issues, and I know this because I've had the pleasure to participate with a group here at the law school that worry about this. The three big issues are, what kind of evidence do algorithms provide? The use of algorithms in sentencing, and the use of algorithms in predictive policing. And then of course the free speech stuff, but that's really not a big legal issue. Nobody cares about that in the legal world. The big legal issue is predictive policing and sentencing. Like in a lot of a lot of jurisdictions and courts here in the United States, and there was an expose about this in ProPublica, but a lot of people have since written about this. Judges rely on a recidivism algorithm score for the defendant that's in front of them in order to determine sentencing. This algorithm is produced by a series of questions that the defendant is asked that are not protected by what in the United States are called Miranda rights, because they're totally, they're not incriminating questions. right? So it's not like they need a lawyer present to answer them. There's like, where did you grow up? Those kinds of questions that are the classic kinds of logistical algorithmic types of data points generating questions. And on this basis, the judge has this, let's say a 1 to 10 score that says 9 is most likely to be a recidivist and commit crimes again, and 1 is the least likely. 10 and 1, and on the basis of this score, the judge decides whether to sentence or not. Right. So this is the sort of core of the problem, and of course, the bigger issue is one of, okay, we got to regulate it, but the algorithm is protected by but it's black box. It's corporate protected, right? So the courts don't actually have access, and probably nobody has access because it's an AI system, to how it makes the decisions.
Yeah, and nobody knows how this works. Let me just, this is fascinating, but I want to two things I just want to sort of throw out there for organizationally. Since we started a little late, are you cool going a few more minutes just to answer like another question or two? Okay, so to do that, Dr. Clowney, my colleague here he is, has a couple questions for you.
Sure.
So go ahead. I'm gonna let him. Go ahead, David.
Okay. There I am. Hi, and thank you so much for this fascinating talk. And my first question was related to something I read in the New York Times about 2 weeks ago by Shoshana Zuboff.
Oh, sure.
I thought you would probably know who she was.
Yeah, no, I reviewed her book.
You reviewed her book?
Yeah.
Cool. Well, I got two questions. I'll tell you what they both are, because they're very different questions, but maybe they connect. And the first one was, what do you make of what she has to say? You seem to be ending up at the same place in terms of, this is transformative. It's a wholly different from what we've encountered before, and we need a completely new way of dealing with it. We're not even sure what it is yet, but we better wake up pretty fast, because we're being cybernetized into data instead of being people. There's that. And then the other thing was, in terms of how you get there, my son's a digital photographer, and I'm quite resistant to the idea that digital photography is not an image or a representation, or that even by now, that the primary nature of photography is simply mechanical transcription from the world to the media. It stopped being that, I think, a long time ago. Simply, So in that sense, but you need the algorithm not being an image, not presenting itself to us in any way that we can even relate to. And yet it's remaking us as where you end up with, what are we going to do about it? And so I'm curious as to what tools you've given us to work on that, or whether you're still a little unsure about that.
Well, so, I'm not going to satisfy the latter answer, because today I was just trying to present a series of issues that I consider, present the way in which I consider the problem, or the set of questions that concern me. And for me, what's important is, as a political theorist, as an academic, that we work really hard to figure out what it is that we're talking about, and how it is that we're interrogating what it is that we're talking about, rather than just saying, oh, it's like that, and it's, and it's just kind of being lazy. And I have to admit that, like, my answer is, and since I published it, I'm happy to admit this. To your first question, is that I think that Shoshana Zuboff's work is quite lazy in that regard. It's lazy in two ways. One, because of I don't think that classical humanism, and the loss of classical humanism, which is effectively what she's talking about, is, we lost that a long time ago. When we put people on slave ships, we lost class. As far as I'm concerned, we lost classical humanism and the ideal. So that's just a fantasy that we keep calling back in order to make ourselves feel good. But that's my sort of personal rep. But the more important thing with regards to Shoshana Feldman's book, sorry, not Shoshana Feldman, Shoshana Zuboff's book, is that she makes this really weird move that her solution is to go back to basically like post-war industrialization. Like her problem isn't the digitization of every life. It's because she's coming from a management department. Her problem is the digitization of finance, right? And the fact that an economy and the management of the economy is no longer based on material reality. And so she says, let's go back to a world of industry. She's explicit about this. And I'm like, really? That's your solution? So we want lower, we go back to a time when there were lower wages and, women weren't allowed to work and all that, that to me seemed, really, really problematic in the way in which she sort of constructed the problem and the solutions. But where we both, are, I think everybody is in agreement on this, is that this is a moment, this is one of the tasks that's before us that the humanities and social sciences have to deal with, right? Which is like, how do we deal with these things? And I actually think that, in very important ways, it's connected to the question of, and it's much beyond the scope of this talk, but I think, and I couldn't do it right now, but I think it's very much connected to the questions of race and colonial settler sort of ideologies, as well as the question of the Anthropocene and the environment. These are, I consider these the three major problems in our horizon that I think are very much interconnected in a lot of really interesting ways.
Yeah, I'd like to hear at some point some of your thoughts about the connection of the colonialism and the slavery thing to this. But certainly, it's a kind of an automation of society in an individualized way that doesn't really treat us as individuals but data. And at least I see it that way. And as in some ways, it's simply, here's a great new technique that we can use to do much better, more accurately what we've been doing right along, which was the creation of consumer society and manufacturing desires and then selling them to us and all the rest of that. Only you can do it one at a time. But then her problem was about the data being collected and then automating everything about sending her father messages. You must need such and such surgery for your cancer or something like that.
So all of those things are true, but I'll stop here because this could go on ad nauseum. But there's a really great book. The author, I mentioned him, Colin Koopman, How We Became Our Data. And it is actually a much better sort of historical study than what Zuboff presents.
C or K?
Koopman.
Yep.
And
what's the name?
Colin Koopman.
No, I mean
How We Became Our Data. I can tell you, David.
Thank you. Yeah, cool.
It's and what it does is that it traces a set of important moments in the 10s, 20s, and 30s in the United States, and he is looking just at the United States when forms began to enter into the experience of citizenship, and sort of isolates that moment, which is also real. For him, it's important as a topic for his book, but it's also, that's what enabled real estate redlining.
Right.
And he traces, and this is why I say all these things are sort of interconnected.
Yes.
But the reality is that, the the question of the human, the question of the human is definitely up for grabs. But what Colin's book does really well is give you a sort of a specific moment in which the development of forms and the intellectual history of the development of these forms is enacted as a governmental practice.
Mm-hmm.
So on that note, I would like to thank everyone for coming. I'd like to thank Professor Panagia. I want to pronounce it. I want to pronounce it the proper way, and I'm butchering it. I'm just killing it. Anyway,
well, it's because I pronounce it the correct way is the Greek way, which is Panagia. But
it's even worse.
Having been born Italian, grown up in Italy, and having the family history in Italy, it's never been pronounced that way. It's always been pronounced Panagia. But Demetrius will tell you that it should be Panagia, right?
Panagia.
Yeah.
Good sound.
Anyway, thank everyone for attending. I want to thank Davide for just a fascinating talk. And I want to apologize for sort of technical difficulties and format weirdness. But this is, you've helped us to get started again, and I think you've posed some incredibly important questions, and we've got a recording of this discussion which we'll kind of put up, and hopefully more people will be able to see it, and I think it's, I think I have to say I want to have you back to have you answer the question of how all this connects to environment and sort of and racism. I really do. I think that's a talk I want to hear. But that's for another time.
Absolutely. Although I can, there are people that are working on it that are much better at it than I am. Marissa Parham, for instance, her work is really fascinating. I mean, just amazing in this. Yep. But I'm happy to do it anytime. But more importantly, thank you for this on my behalf as well. I really enjoyed it. And it's the crowning achievement on my quarter, which ends today. This is the last obligation I have for my teaching quarter. So it's a great way to end.
Congratulations, and you totally deserve a drink now. All right, I'm gonna kill the recording. And
I'm afraid that what I deserve is to help my daughter with her homework, because that's what's next on my agenda.
There you go. All right.